Hello, and welcome to the Kimberly Cloud Show. I'm your host, Kimberly Cloud. Today we have a very, very special guest for the show today. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Kimberly Cloud Show. I'm your host, Kimberly Cloud. Today I got a very, very special guest here for the show today. Can you go ahead and announce to the world who you are and where you're calling from?
So I'm author Paul Rushworth-Brown, and I'm calling from Sydney, Australia. Welcome to sunny Sydney.
What is the temperature out there, by the way?
Today it's about 30 degrees.
Okay. How can you tell me about your past leading up into your present?
Sure. So I'm actually a high school teacher, educator, but prior to that, I've been teaching for about 23 years, and prior to that, I was a navvy. In other words, we used to build track out in the outback, out in the bush, in the desert. And I was born in England, went to high school in Canada, and came out here to Australia in the 1980s, and have been here ever since. Wonderful place.
Okay. And what is the culture? Tell me about the culture in Australia.
Are we talking about First Nations culture, or are we talking about, because there's two? Both.
However.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So our sort of like culture probably would. I mean, I've been to the US a number of times, and I really don't think that our cultures are much different. Probably our sense of humor is a little bit more a little bit more quirky. But yeah, that modern westernized culture is pretty similar. First Nations culture, that's a whole new history that hopefully people will find out more about in my novel Outback Odyssey.
Okay. And is the food like, how is the food? Do y'all eat like Americans? Like, how long does it take to get over to Australia from the United States?
Oh,
And yeah.
it's like 24 hours. It's a long trip. So usually people stop off in Dubai or Hawaii, and yeah, it's a full day travel on the plane. So yeah, very difficult, but well worth it when you get here.
Tell me about your book. Tell me about what it represents to you.
Okay, so Outback Odyssey is at face value is a historical fiction, um, romance, adventure type story. Um, about a young man that emigrates to Australia in the 1950s. And at that time, they had the Australian government had a scheme called the £10 POM, or the migrant scheme. And the Australian government had an all-white policy, which obviously I disagree with, and most Australians do. But the idea was to give British people an opportunity to come to Australia, and the Australian government would pay for it. So they'd pay for their boat, they'd find them a job, they would get them somewhere to live, and that would only cost them $10 to do that. And my father was a £10 POM, what we call a £10 POM. He came out to Australia in the 1950s, so the novel Outback Odyssey is actually loosely based on his emigration and his time in the outback, his time working on a sheep station. And I mean, our sheep stations in the outback could be the size of England, so they're pretty huge properties. And then on the lower level, it's basically a novel that holds up a mirror for people to look at with regard to colonization, how um, how
I'm sorry, I'm getting an Amber Alert. Sorry. Um, Go ahead.
and so it's, if you look deeper into the novel is allegorical, and it looks at it doesn't preach, but it looks at things like the effects of colonization. It looks at the effects of that quiet racism, that type of thing.
Now, is this quiet racism between a certain race, or is it all races? Is it one race? How does it work?
Mainly, it's about look. It builds a beautiful tapestry of First Nations culture, and it's sort of like doesn't highlight. It's very quiet, and it sort of like identifies what effect British colonization had on First Nations people that have been living there for 60,000 years. And we have the thing called the stolen generation, where First Nations people were basically rounded up and put into orphanages and homes so that they could be made white, for lack of a better word.
Would you just say they gave away?
They were collected up. They were rounded up, and put into orphanages, and basically westernized. They were taught to be white, to be white Australians, and of course they weren't allowed to use their own names, weren't allowed to speak their own language. Now back then, when we talk about First Nations people, there was something like maybe 300 tribes across Australia, 300 different mobs, and a lot of the First Nations language has been lost because of that.
Who did this to the 300 tribes that lost their voice? Who? The government?
Yeah, the
Was it
government.
the main? Oh, wow. Wow. And how have y'all recovered culturally from that, or have y'all recovered?
Well, they haven't recovered, or we haven't recovered, and that's partly what the book is about. It's about highlighting the beautiful tapestry of First Nations people, their culture, and embracing it, and that type of thing. Now, back in 2023, Australia had a referendum to allow First Nations people to have a say in the Constitution, and the referendum was actually knocked back. So nothing's really changed since the British actually, some say invaded, some say settled in Australia.
Do the First Nation, the people of the First Nation, have the right to advocate for themselves? Obviously, they don't if they cannot speak their language and was taught to speak one unified language and was reprogrammed. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, there's a lot of people in Australia that want to see treaties. They want to see First Nations people with more of a say about how they live, and their own their own lives. And the Outback Odyssey, the story, actually, as I say, it doesn't preach. It just in a quiet way holds up a mirror to basically any country that has been colonized. So it's, even though it's about Australia, and it's about the Australian Outback, and it's about Australian characters and that type of thing. Many people can actually see the similarities between our First Nations people and sort of like the Indians in America, or the Eskimos in northern Canada.
Okay, and so the recolonization and reprogram started happening because the tribes, the 300 tribes, been here for 60,000 years in Australia, and it started happening, the recolonization and reprogramming, from 1950 to 25. So that's like almost 75 to 100 years, almost a century.
Yeah. Look, I mean, thank goodness the people of Australia have seen have this new wisdom where a lot of people are starting to say, hey, this isn't fair, you know. And that's what part of the referendum was about. It was about giving them their say, and allowing them their say in the Constitution. I mean, First Nations people in Australia, and look, I say First Nations people or Aboriginals, right? We don't use the word Indigenous anymore, but Aboriginal people, they didn't get the opportunity to vote until I think it was the 70s, right?
Get out of here.
It's true, yeah.
And
then
okay.
and then unlike all other Australians, if we don't vote, we get fined. But the Australian government didn't really care if they voted or not, so they didn't get fined. They were given the opportunity to vote, but if you want to vote, vote. If you don't.
How did that make the people feel, and how have they took a step further towards freedom of speech?
Well, there's a lot of I mean, now obviously now they've got the opportunity to vote, and now there's a lot of both Aboriginal people and white Australians that are speaking up, saying, "Look, this isn't fair. We need to change this." So, fortunately, as a species and as a country, we've grown since the 1950s, and there was a treaty down in Victoria that has just been passed. A lot of people have been fighting to sort of like give Aboriginal people more of a, I suppose, more of their land, basically. It's their land. They've been living here since 60,000 years, and I think one of the reasons the referendum didn't work was because white Australians are scared. They're scared of. I think they're scared of different things, and I think that's, I suppose, one of the important things about Outback Odyssey is that it in a very, very quiet and non-preaching way, it holds up a mirror to white Australians to say, look, First Nations people do have a beautiful culture. We should embrace that. And as time goes on, we're improving as a species. There's still a long way to go. We're improving as a species and as a country.
Well said. And what if the indigenous people that are oppressed advocate properly? Would they get tossed in jail, or they get ticketed? How, like, you could, like, they couldn't vote until the 70s. I'm just curious to know, what do they do when they're being oppressed, and how do they maneuver around it by advocating and letting the government see that they're not a threat, but they are someone who is a citizen and is a voter?
Look, that's a huge question because and I could probably talk about that for for an hour. But I suppose one way of saying it is that in areas of Australia where there's a high First Nations population, there's a lot of issues with alcohol abuse. There's a lot of legal issues with First Nations people put in jail, and unfortunately, usually the time in jail is put it this way: they tend to not last very long under in jail because First Nations people they're so tied to the land, right? The land is like their church, and I suppose that sort of like culture is one of the, I suppose, is one of the rich things that comes out of Outback knowledge, Outback Odyssey. And there's a lot of things like mental health issues, and there's huge, huge social issues around Australia with regard to First Nations people.
Okay, and tell me more about the territory portion. Let's rewind. So, in the African American and low immigration class people, they fight over territory, and it's a full blown war in the United States secretively about this. Now, in Australia, obviously the indigenous people want their land, but they can't fight. So what is it that they do to make themselves known, and how do they grow and advocate and try to fight for their land?
Well, there's a makeshift uh, embassy behind the old government house in Canberra, right? And it's illegal. It's not supposed to be there, but they use that as their embassy. Um, you spoke about war. There's no wars. First Nations people are quiet. I suppose quiet achievers. We've had a lot of like First Nations people, go to university. We've got First Nations people, some as senators in government and that type of thing. But there's still that marginalisation, right? So the way they tend to, I suppose, change things is in a quiet way about being there and sort of like trying to show other sort of like white Australians that that there's nothing to be feared.
I think the solution would be to everybody to get together in a meet and diversity and write down their issues they have and explain their issues that they have and try to come up with a solution. Even if they don't get along, maybe they have a resolution, you know. How do you feel
Yeah.
about that scenario? Do you think that something can transpire if the government in Australia can come up with a solution for the indigenous people to own or have their property rights or own their land?
Look, that's been spoken about for 20 years. And as I say, in Victoria, they've just passed a treaty where, like for instance, uh, Uluru, which some of you may have heard of, which is like the big monolith in the middle of Australia. The Australian government has given that back to Aboriginal people, right? So that land around Uluru, which is quite sacred to them, actually belongs to Aboriginal people, right? And quietly and slowly, those types of things are starting to happen. Like for instance, behind me is Tataguta, which uh, is another like sacred place for Aboriginal First Nations people. That's being given back to them. But
Good.
slowly, and in Victoria, with that treaty, and this is sort of like hot off the press, they will be given some of the crown land in that area.
Okay, and that's pretty cool that some of them been given the land. So how far back, with technology is the indigenous people versus Australia?
With
Like,
regard to
do they
technology,
go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry, what did you say?
with regard to technology,
Yeah, like is the indigenous people do they have like do they collaborate with Australian technology, or are they like the people who ride horses or something? Like, what is the indigenous people culture and their character?
okay, so as I said before, First Nations people are very, very heavily tied to the land. Um, they 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 believe in something called the dreaming, and it's something that white Australians can't really wrap their head around. You know, it's sort of like, for instance, every rock, every plant, every animal is actually part of their culture and part of their essence of being Aboriginal. And they do. And look, as I said before, there's various different types of situations. I mean, we've got First Nations kids going to Australian schools in the city, and then on the other hand, there's families, say in Alice Springs, which is right out in central Australia, where there's sort of like I suppose a fenced in, what you guys would call a reserve, and white Australians aren't allowed in there. They don't go in there, right? And I remember being there a few years ago, and I was driving on the outside of it in a taxi. I asked the taxi man, what's going on with all the fires over there? Like, you could see sort of like houses or wooden structures, and they say, oh, they're just fires, because the First Nations people, they rip up the wooden floorboards and build a fire to cook and that type of thing.
And that's their culture. Oh wow. So if you had to give more information about your book,
Yeah.
which you gave it enough, what would you say about your book to keep the readers? What would you say, some type of excerpt in the book that you can remember that you would say about how this culture, this indigenous culture, isn't, and I know how they are because you just said it, but how they is and how they have tell me more about the storyline.
Okay, so storyline, just quickly, is about a young Englishman that emigrates to the outback in 1950s Australia, and it's he feels like he doesn't belong anywhere, because he spent most of his childhood in an orphanage. He tried to join the services, but couldn't. And then his plan B was to come to Australia. So he arrives in Australia, and he doesn't feel like he belongs anywhere. So they send him out to the outback, and he works on a sheep station. And through that work, he got to know First Nation stockmen, who are arguably the best in the world. And one of their elders or senior people actually takes him under their wing, and basically teaches him the ways of the outback, how to survive. And then there's a love interest between Jimmy and the young white woman that actually owns the station, or the huge farm. Then she's going to lose that, because there's a court case, and her uncle, who's the antagonist in the novel, he's trying to get a hold of her farm, which was left to her in the will. So the only way that she can keep the station is by Jimmy helping her to find something called Weiberg's gold, which is a true story. And there's still people out there in Australia looking for Weiberg's gold. And
Is it real?
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. And I can't say too much to spoil it, but it's and through those connections with the First Nations elder, who's called Uncle Jarrah, because in Australia we respect our First Nations people by calling them, the older ones, the elders, by calling them uncle and auntie, right? So Uncle Jarrah basically takes him into the village, and Jimmy eventually becomes initiated as a First Nations person.
Okay,
right?
that is
And
awesome.
just through those processes, it in an allegorical way, it gives you an opportunity to see behind that, I suppose, that wall of First Nations culture into the nitty gritty, and things like that I've spoken about, like First Nations culture, and I did a huge amount of research. I went into sort of like databases, like going back into the 1800s, to look at sort of like this very, very strong initiation process. Anyway, he becomes the first.
We're
Sorry.
running out of time, Paul. So what made you pursue this book? What clicked in your head that you said, you know what, I'm going to take and stand for the Indigenous people? What happened?
A couple of things. The first thing was that the referendum being knocked back. I thought that was extremely unfair, but I've been on and that's silence, keeping them in silence, I think is very unfair. And I've been in a similar situation where I was asked to be silent. It's not a nice way to be. So if you add all those things up, that's part of it. The other part of it is I've written 3 other books, historical fiction books, and I wanted this 4th book to actually mean something. I wanted it to be important. I wanted it to change how humans see First Nations people, how their culture should be appreciated and not hidden. I wanted to show how a young white immigrant, how his beliefs about First Nations people, how they changed over a period of time, and how he was able to, rather than fear it, but to embrace it, their culture.
Well said, Paul. And where are you going in the future with this book?
Well, the one thing about my novels is I love twists and turns, right? And I finished the novel, but then after I finished that story at the end of the novel, I kept writing about it, put a few, I suppose, sparks into where the next novel could go, and then I said to be continued. But obviously, it depends on how Outback Odyssey is, I suppose, appreciated by the public, to whether I write another one. I'll definitely write another book, but I don't. I mean, I've been told that to the people that have read this book, that it could be the most important novel from an Australian author in the last decade.
Yeah, you said something about To Kill a Mockingbird, how it kind of compares to that. And To Kill a Mockingbird, I remember I was in 9th grade and read or saw the movie, so I get what you're saying. How can the people reach you, Paul?
Okay, so I've got a website, www.paulrushworth-brown.com, or if they just do a Google search on Paul Rushworth-Brown, all the information about Outback Odyssey and my other 3 novels come up. But I think Outback Odyssey, even though it's from an Australian author and it's an Australian story, I believe it's very, very relevant to any of our species in the world.
Well said. Well said. Stay on the line, Paul. I'll leave it there. Thank you guys. I appreciate you guys for joining my show today. Be safe, take care, and I will see you guys another time. Bye.